Welcome to BYJU'S IAS and welcome to our weekly review of international affairs. In this curated version of international relations, changing power equations, our effort is to prepare you for questions specific and more general that can be asked in the competitive examinations. And this time what we want to discuss with you is a topic which is often neglected, and recent events have forced us to think about this. And this topic is about rise and decline of resurgent powers, regional powers, powers predominant in a region, and their changing status. What has forced us to think about this is the recent round of negotiations about Afghanistan, which are being held in Iran, and suddenly Iran, which was the bête noire of the Americans, suddenly seems to have found favor, and these negotiations with Taliban are involved with Russia, America, China. And of course, Pakistan is, as a country sharing a border, is very much there. India is not among these countries which are negotiating, but this is interesting because in the sense, Iranians were invited by the Americans to come and join the negotiations, the other round of negotiations in Doha, in Qatar, but they said no, they will not sit across the table with the Americans because the Americans have proved to be very recalcitrant about lifting sanctions on Iran and continue with their bullying position. Now, Iran for a long time has been treated as a pariah, treated as a rogue state, and has been constrained to draw closer to China. But the Afghan crisis, the Taliban assault on Afghanistan, has made it clear that perhaps Iran has a role to play not only in Afghanistan, but in this region. Other events which forced us to think about regional powers in this area was Saudi Arab. Now, Saudi Arab has been trying to diversify its post-fossil fuel economy in coming years. It is also trying to worry about if Iran is rehabilitated, Iran resumes its nuclear program, what would it mean for its strategic security? The same kind of considerations are there among the UAE, what are known as the Gulf states. Of course, Israel is very much there on the periphery, and Israel has tried to normalize its relations with Saudi Arab to corner Iran. Now, what is happening in this area in the Middle East is there are two contending powers for regional dominance. One is Iran, the other is Saudi Arabia and UAE combined. But what we would like you to keep in mind is that this is not the case only in the Middle East. If you go to Southeast Asia, you have a traditionally claimant for a predominant role in the region, Indonesia. After the reunification of Vietnam, Indonesia both can compete for this. If you think in terms of South Asia, none of India's neighbors can hope to compete with India, but India's predominance in the region has to a large extent been nullified by its border conflict with China, and China trying to gang up all its smaller neighbors against India. The raging conflict in Afghanistan, embittered relations with Pakistan have reduced India's ambition to play a predominant role not only in South Asia, but in Asia. If you go to African continent, there was a time South Africa was supposed to be a regionally dominant power, carving out a role for its leadership in the continent. You go to Latin America and you had the Brazil, easily identified for its expanse of land, its resources, its technological sophistication. Now, what has happened is that the concept of regional powers, the concept of emerging powers, the concept of resurgent powers, the concept of a nation state which claims on its historic memories of a predominant role in its region is not very compatible with the global system where the two superpowers dominated it during the Cold War, or after that time there was a small thaw, there was emergence of multipolarity, there was emergence of European Union. So one thought that the times were changing. And our focus was concentrated on what was happening in relations between first the two superpowers, then the big powers, USA, Russia, China, European Union, major actors in Europe. But then in recent years, there has been this discussion of China's resurgence. Now, if you talk in terms of China's resurgence, China is a major resurgent power on the global scene. It doesn't see itself, nor does anybody else on the international arena sees it as a regional power. So what we are trying to focus this time in this dialogue with you is to focus on regionally important powers, which are also referred to as medium powers, And when their equations change, they are referred to as resurgent powers. The powers which might be emerging powers. If you look at them with a friendly prism of eyes, you call them emerging powers. If you do not like them, if you think them they are hostile to your interest, you refer to them as resurgent or revolutionary powers, which might upset the status quo in international relations. This is what we are going to do with you this time in the context of Middle East. Subsequently, we'll take up other regional powers like Turkey, regional powers like Ethiopia, which are positioned in a situation geopolitically where they exercise control not only in the continent where they are, but transcontinentally. Then we would, of course, take a look at other powers on the African continent. Now, one more thing before we proceed any further is, when we talk of middle powers, regional powers, another thing common to them is they have long historical memories. They have memories of empires in past. They have memories about their own past, about their own glorious empires, and which gives them feeling that they are natural contenders for a role in their region. Problem arises when there are more than one actors, like in Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE combined. So this is what we are going to discuss with you. I think this is important enough a topic because as America is declining and retreating, Russia is willing to play a secondary role. So China is the only aggressive expansionist power. Can these regional powers offer a pushback, or China can use them to its advantage to increase its global footprint and to corner America even further? Let us begin with Iran. Iran is one of the most ancient civilizations in the world. It dates back thousands of years before the birth of Christ. It is contemporaneous of great civilizations of Mesopotamia, in Egypt and elsewhere. And it has historical memories of a very sophisticated civilization in the time of Xerxes the Great, who's referred to in the invasions of Alexander and his armies chronicles. But then it is a pre-Islamic Iran, which was called Faras, and it had influence. It is a vast empire which included most of the territories which now comprise bits of Iraq, bits of Uzbekistan, bits of Tajikistan, bits of Afghanistan, and so on. So this is the historic memories of a great civilization, great empires of Iranian people. But then with the advent of Islam, this ancient Iranian civilization gave way to an Islamic civilization, but its contributions to Islamic civilizations continued. Tehran became a center for science, culture, language, scholarship, arts, crafts of various kinds, and it continued to influence other nations in the neighborhood. But what we are concerned about is not the historical footprint of Persian stroke Iranian civilization, but we also have to explore the relationship which this civilization had with the caliphate in Constantinople, and where all nations Islamic nations in the world looked westwards to that direction. This is where the roots of ancient rivalry between Saudi Arab and Iranians are also sown. You have Saudi Arab, where the advent of Islam was witnessed, encountered, and where the holiest shrines of Islam, Medina and Mecca, are located. Now, what happens is that this draws the Muslim community from all over the world to these places of pilgrimage, and Saudis can claim that they are the keepers of these shrines. But interestingly, the international significance of Saudi Arabs, although they now claim that they have roots in history as far back as tens of thousands of years, where prehistoric evidence has been brought out in excavations of pottery, of artwork, of civilization, context with the world outside. But let's remember, this again was a time when this tract of land was not identified as an Islamic nation. The holy shrines had not come up to be recognized as such in Makkah or Medina. It only happened after the Prophet had the revelation of Quran Sharif, the Holy Quran, and may peace be on the Prophet. That was when the expansion of Islamic power started. So, but then Saudi Arab lay claims to a historical tradition prehistoric, but the rest of the world doesn't recognize, as it recognizes the Iranian civilization as one of the ancient great civilizations of the world. So there's one divide. Shia-Sunni divide is one, and the claims to ancient civilization being an inheritor too is another. Now, what we must keep in mind is that whether it is Iran or whether it is Saudi Arab, both these regional actors had experienced a decline. So let's come to Iran. When Iran converted to Islam, the Parsis, the original inhabitants, were persecuted. They took shelter in India, most of them, and that's only where they are now extant. In Iran, there are no Parsis of the fire-worshipping Zoroastrian faith, etc. Now, Iran again was not its mighty imperial self through history after Constantinople emerged. So the rise of Turkey, slightly away from the this center of power, reduced the regional influence of Iran. At one time, the Byzantium Empire, when it had been conquered by Greeks and Romans, and the influence was there, but then the Islamic forces retook Constantinople. So between Byzantium and Constantinople and Istanbul, there was 500, 600, 700-year period when from frontiers of China to Cordoba in Spain stretched the Islamic empire. This was the time when Iran was reduced to being a marginal power in the region. Now, some of this is reflected in current, which we shall discuss this time and in the next encounters with you, where we must recognize that Iran was not major power, not even a major regional power. It was only used as a buffer or a pawn in the great game between the imperial rivalry between Great Britain and Russia. So Russians wanted to exclude British influence in Iran. Iranians, the British did not want the Russian influence to be there in Tehran, and they thought that the route to India would be affected. And also the Germans and other European powers were active to play as minor actors in this great game. So this great game in the 19th century was something where Iran was not entirely an independent actor. Now what happened is that after the First World War, there were changes in Iran, and a new dynasty was installed to look after the interest of the Western imperial powers, and Shah Reza Shah Pahlavi and his father and he took over successively the throne of Iran. Till that time, Iran was again not aspiring to play an independent role. It was only when oil was discovered and the British and the Americans realized that they could control this oil, they gave a significance to the ruling family in Iran and tried to win it over to their side. So this is pre-Cold War alignment of Reza Shah Pahlavi's dynasty and his own individual commitment to the Americans and the Westerners. He used his oil wealth very interestingly in ironically different ways. He spent money on education, on infrastructure. He claimed to modernize his nation, which was a bit of a trauma for an Islamic Orthodox Shia majority population nation. But then it was a modern Iran which seemed to appeal to the Western world much more during the Cold War, and they did not realize that the regime of Shah itself was an oppressive regime. There was a secret service which tortured his dissenters. The distribution of wealth was not even. Most of the modern, pro-Western, liberal lifestyle was confined to Iran, and Shah was criticized very strongly by Islamic clerics. One of them was Ayatollah Khomeini, who had to go away from Iran because he criticized Shah and his un-Islamic ways and take refuge in France. That comes a little later. There was a democratic movement in Iran. Mossadegh was the prime minister, but the Western powers realized, both America and Great Britain, if Iran were truly democratic, their oil interests in the country would be jeopardized. So there was a CIA organized coup. Mossadegh was ousted, killed, and Shah of Iran became an unchallenged autocrat. As long as he played along with the Western powers, everything was good. But when he became too big for his boots, according to the Americans, they were a bit unhappy with him. But in the meantime, the resentment against Shah was increasing. He tried to crush dissent with brutal power, did not succeed. And in 1979, and this is the landmark, this is the milestone wherefrom the story of modern Iran as a regionally important actor or an influential actor begins. The Islamic Revolution took place. Shah was ousted and banished from his country. Ayatollah Khomeini installed himself as the supreme leader in Tehran. So people thought that once he comes, the stranglehold of the intelligence agencies torturing police would be broken, but different alternative parallel set of tormentors of the citizen in Iran emerged. These were the Revolutionary Guards, they were the Orthodox clerics. And what was most distressing was that the Americans were so worried about their interests that they tried to have a bullying posture towards the new Khomeini, and the Khomeini did not like the Americans trying to unsettle him. So the American embassy was sieged, and American diplomats were held in hostage. To begin with, there were 60 plus hostages, then the women and children were released, but more than 50 hostages remained in captivity. And this is where the relationship between Iran and America started souring. The then President Carter tried to release the hostages by sending some helicopters. The helicopters did not function properly in a different climate. One helicopter crashed with a transport plane, killing 7 or 8 American officers and soldiers. Carter had to apologize and own up responsibility. And most people think that his failure to get re-elected was largely dependent on this failed military intervention in Iran. The Americans retaliated very crudely by freezing Iranian resources, which were in American banks and so on, and refused to recognize the new regime in Iran. Diplomatic relations were broken. There was a long-drawn arbitration. Iranians got some of their frozen funds back, but a lot of ill will was there. This was not enough. Now, what happened is the Americans wanted to get rid of Khomeini one way or the other, weaken Iran one way or the other. So they tried to egg on the dictator in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, then to take on Iran. And thus started the Iran-Iraq war, which lasted 8 years, a little more than 8 years, in 1980. The cost of war was very great for both Iraq and Iran. First, Iran was caught by surprise when Iraqi forces marched dramatically and captured Khorramshahr, but they failed to capture the oil resources next door in Amman. And what happened was, when the Iranians retaliated, the Iraqis had not expected that they would retaliate with such revolutionary zeal, such fervor, nationalistic fervor, such dogmatic sense of martyrdom, that the Iraqis were pushed back outside the Iranian border. And then the Iranians launched a counter-offensive and tried to get inside the Iraqi territory. But once they were inside Iraqi territory, the Iraqi resistance proved to be too strong for them, and another stalemate resulted. Now, the interesting part is this long-drawn 8-year war weakened both countries, and this was the beginning of the end of Saddam Hussein, in a manner of speaking. The cost of war for both nations was devastating. Iran was weakened but not defeated. Iraq was almost hollowed out, but then the megalomaniacal intentions of Saddam Hussein were fanned by the Americans, and he also launched an attack on Kuwait. Now, Kuwait was oil-rich. Historically, Iraq thought that it claimed the territory. Iraq at that stage wanted to be the dominant regional power, but the moment Iraq attacked Kuwait, a multinational coalition against it was formed, economic sanctions were imposed, and Iraq was forced in a couple of months to withdraw from Kuwait and get back. This again cost Iraq dear, because it was possible for the West to demonize Iraq and say that there was a tyrant who prized other people's resources, who was using chemical weapons and gases against dissenters in his own country. And this again was a Shia-Sunni confrontation of sorts. Iraqis again were inheritors to an ancient civilization, but they were predominantly Arab, with a small Shia minority there. The Shia majority was there in certain parts, but the leader, Saddam Hussein, was a Sunni, and also it had problems of other minorities like Kurds, and the Kurds were spread over between Iraq and Iran, bits of Turkey. So this was a clash. But then the Iran-Iraq war plus the Gulf War saw to it that the West began to see Iran as a principal enemy, and also its neighbors to West like Iraq also became enemies for all time to come, at least in decadal time frame. Now, it had technological capacities. It launched a nuclear program. Interestingly, ironically, the nuclear program started with American assistance when Raza Shah Pahlavi was there. In 1979, it was stopped. But the Iranians thought that to survive, they needed a nuclear weapon, and they tried to revive their nuclear program. They tried to get from China, they tried to get from other sources clandestinely to keep going their nuclear program. Now, they kept saying that their nuclear program was for peaceful uses, for economic development, but they were suspected by Israelis who thought that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, their own existence would be in great danger. Same was the case with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia only kept protesting and putting pressure on the United States to have economic sanctions on Iran, but Israel tried to subvert the Iranian nuclear program by cloak and dagger methods, by assassination of Iranian scientists, by sabotage in Iranian nuclear installations. Now, all this continued, and Iran's determination to take on America became stronger and stronger. At one level, the Iranians wanted to be accepted as a responsible state in international community. At the same time, the Americans were trying, because of their animosity with Iran, to demonize them and to say that Iran was a rogue state. Now, once Trump became the president of the United States, he said that he would go back on the agreement which President Obama, his predecessor, had worked out in 2015, a comprehensive agreement with Iran to say that Iran would declare that it would not make nuclear weapons, it would make open its installations for international inspection, and it would not enrich uranium beyond a certain percentage. But this commitment, when it was broken by Trump, Iranians thought that they were free to do what they wanted to do, despite Israeli sabotage with their nuclear program. Now, we must not forget that Iran, besides the historical memories, besides its technological competence, also is a country which is a very important oil producing and oil exporting country. It has very large reserves of oil and natural gas. At one stage, India itself was importing 10% of energy needs from Iran, which amounted to $19 to $20 billion per year. And this again has been a conflict area, because since Iraq, after the regime change, was removed from the international stage, Americans took over control of its infrastructure, took over control of the oil resources, etc. It was not in a position to play a role, and then it became between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But when the Americans imposed very strict sanctions on Iran, Iran's grouse was that it was not even having foreign exchange earned through its oil exports, which could allow it to buy medicines, even at the height of the corona pandemic. Now, this is an issue on which one can see the logic of Iran's complaints. It says that unless President Biden withdraws the sanctions imposed by Trump, no progress in the talks about nuclear normalization can take place. Americans insist that Iranians must show their goodwill and take some steps, first of all, confidence building, before the Americans reciprocate. Now, this is a chicken and egg situation. What happens first? No side is blinking, and Iranians probably have been forced to come closer and closer to China because of this intransigence of the Americans. Biden, unfortunately, thinks that he cannot give way to Iranian demands because people would think he's a weak president. Iranians have no such problem worrying about public opinion and so on. In between, the period between 2012 to present day has been this pendulum swing between Obama's conciliatory moves to Trump's confrontation to Biden's initial conciliation, but going back on these words. Before that, Iranians had been trying to let the world know that they would like to have sovereign control over their oil and their gas and keep dealing with it. Now, this has resulted in a situation where one major actor, one regional power, which is recognized the world over as a upper middle class country, upper middle income, not middle class, upper middle income country, almost developed country, has been crippled to an extent to depend on illegal, extra legal deals to either export its oil or gas. Indian interest has been directly affected because India at one stage was helping Iran build the Shah Bahar port, but after the American pressure, the Indians withdrew from the arena. They reduced their oil imports from Iran. They abstained themselves on the anti-Iranian vote in United Nations. And this, of course, did not please the Iranians. So the net result is that today the Iranians have signed a deal of $400 billion with China, which will cover next quarter century. And once this happens, there is little chance of India getting a foothold in Iran again. So as far as we are concerned, our interests seem to be adversely affected for foreseeable future. At the same time, can Iran play a role after taking this initiative on the Afghan talks, work its way into the region as a regional power is there. Iran's capacity to even hit Saudi Arab through proxies, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, is very much there. Iran has been sending out militias to Syria, to Iraq, and also it has angered Israelis because recently a tanker of Israeli ownership was hit apparently by Iranian weapons supplied to rebels. So Iran could deny this its culpability, but the suspicion lingers on. So can Iran emerge in this region as a dominant power? One has to see. When we come to Saudi Arab and the Gulf countries, we must not forget that despite the claims of thousands of years old civilization, the geopolitical significance of Saudi Arab only emerged after the First World War. After the First World War, when the British wanted to control what they call the trucial states in the Gulf and the Saudi Arab, because nobody knew that they had oil. They were only looked after because of their vast expanse of desert and also being significant in the context of Muslim faith. So there were people like Lawrence of Arabia who were operating as espionage agents in this area, and they probably drew the lines of another great game, not in Central Asia, but in West Asia. But the significance of Saudi Arabia emerged suddenly in the 1950s when oil was discovered, and oil was discovered in vast quantities. Saudi Arab is the second largest oil producing and largest oil exporting country. USA is the largest oil producing country, but then Saudi Arabian exports are much larger. Of course, the rank of the largest oil reserves keep fluctuating as new surveys take place and new discoveries are made, but oil is the source of the wealth of Saudi Arabs. And again, the Seven Sisters, the American oil majors, controlled oil exploration, refining, production, and export. And the Saudis were very happy to get a generous royalty. And during the 50s, another factor reinforced the bonds between the Americans and the Western countries and the Saudi Arab. This was the Cold War. They thought that if Saudi Arab became a partner in their Baghdad Pact, in their CENTO, and it is one of the largest purchasers of American hardware and weaponry. So Americans were prepared to put up with an autocratic, fabulously wasteful expenditure of the Saudi royal family. They got into the news for wrong reasons, but Americans can put up with everything. Now, this Saudis thought that this friendship with the Americans will continue forever and ever. Saudis also coexisted despite the animosity of Israelis with the Arab countries throughout this period. They were very clever opportunistically that they would show sympathy to their Arab Muslim brethren, but do very little to risk a confrontation with Israel directly. So the Americans managed this relationship to a certain extent, but things changed very, very suddenly with 9/11. A terrorist group which had been bred and nourished in Saudi Arab hit the World Trade Towers, and the Americans realized that their ties with Saudi Arab needed a relook. Interestingly, even this incident did not put a strain enough on US-Saudi Arab relations to make any difference to it. But what has happened since then? There have been a lot of things. There has been a crown prince, a modernizer, Mohammed bin Salman, who goes by the name of MBS, who claims to give greater rights to women, to liberate his people. But there are certain other things before we come to his claims to modernization. The tyrannical autocracy continues, as was shown by the murder of a journalist, American passport holder, but journalist of Saudi origin, Khashoggi. And unfortunately, the taint has not quite been washed away from MBS's hands. There have been other incidents of tyrannical behavior against the non-Saudis or even the Saudis or the women's. Now, interestingly, The population of Saudi Arabia is almost touching 10 million. Of this, only 2 million are Saudis. The rest, 8 million, are expatriates. Now, these expatriates are treated as second-class citizens. Some of them are exploited. Some have to live and work in conditions of bondage. The freedom of expression is not there. Even princes of royal blood can be put into prison. Lots of power play and coups take place behind the scene. The princes keep jostling for power. But that besides the point. The wealth of Saudi Arab continues. Saudi Arab is trying to prepare for the day when fossil fuels will not ensure its wealth. It has tried to mend its fences with Israel. A normalization of relationship has begun, partly to keep the Iranian threat in check. And when we come to UAE, the Gulf nations, the more important of them are Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah. The names familiar to Indian, where cricket is played, where lots of Indian expatriates are there. Again, like Saudi Arab, the expatriate population is very high here. But the climate of thought and lifestyle is very different from Saudi Arab. Although they are close allies in South Yemen, they are close allies in their confrontation with Iran, they are close allies in repairing relations with Israel, they are close allies with America. But the far-sighted Sultan, the first president of the UAE, invested his oil wealth in infrastructure, in better facilities in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. But the problems with Saudi Arab's failure to emerge as a major power are that its human rights record, whatever it may claim, is highly suspect. Also, its intervention in Saudi Yemen has led to a situation which has been termed by the UN as one of the greatest humanitarian crises of this century. People are dying of famine, people are malnutrition, and the Houthis, helped by Iranians, have held Saudi Arab from bringing this war to a conclusion. Also, there is an internal not so obvious rivalry between UAE and Saudi Arab, both competing for progressive post-oil future there. So at present, it seems as long as Iran is projecting its power in Syria, in Saudi Yemen, through Houthis, Saudis are a bit restrained at the moment. But at the same time, when we discuss the rise of Islamic fundamentalism as another important feature in international relations, we shall see that all the tangled skein of whether it is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Ansar al-Islam are brought back to Saudi Arab. So the fundamentalist version of Islam being exported, the Wahhabi Islam, through petrodollars is the route that Saudi Arab has followed. It continues to be a place of custodian of the holiest shrines in Islam. It gives us a special position. But it is not exactly in the same position as Iran, but the tensions will continue. That's all we have for you this week. But we would like to remind you, like always, to keep in mind the salient points of what we have discussed. We have discussed this time the role of middle powers, emerging powers, resurgent powers, dominant powers in a region, which seem to affect international relations, contemporary international events, much more than a changing relationship between the major powers, the erstwhile superpowers, or America, Russia, and China. They are no longer playing the role of proxies for their friends and masters. They have ambitions and interests in the region, they have historical memories, and they are having a tug of war in different geographies on the world map. And most important of this kind we see is in the Middle East, where Iran and Saudi Arab are contending for a pole position. We must always keep in mind what Indian interests are. We must have some idea of the historical background, but we must focus on the past decade, past couple of years, and the immediate context, past 6 months or so. If you do that, you will never go wrong. Till we meet again next week. Thank you and goodbye.